This is Chicago. At the dawn of the 21st century, Chicago's media was dominated by a handful of major corporations. But a resistance movement arose to free Chicago's media from their clutches. One player in this movement is the Chicago Independent Media Center and its TV show, Chicago Independent Television. The Independent Media Center is a worldwide network of grassroots correspondents committed to using the tools of the media for promoting social and economic justice. You are watching this month's dispatch from the Chicago Independent Media Center.
Welcome to Chicago Independent Television, a collection of progressive video reports by grassroots media workers produced free from corporate or commercial support or influence. I'm your host, Yadira Correa. In this episode, we'll visit the recent Teachers Union March. We'll hear about a group of protesters indicted on terrorism charges in Chicago. We'll see excerpts from a press conference condemning police violence against anti-NATO protesters. We'll see some excerpts from a recent debate on NATO. And we'll hear from a Chicago activist on a range of topics surrounding NATO. Stay with us.
Chicago Independent Television is not brought to you by McDonald's. Environmental destruction, unhealthy food, low wages, and repressed labor rights. And lawsuits against people who talk about it. Learn more at mclibel.org. McDonald's, I'm not loving it.
Welcome back to Chicago Independent Television. On May 23, 2012, the Chicago Teachers Union held a massive rally in March in downtown Chicago demanding an end to school cuts, privatization, and union-busting tactics. We'll have a quick look in this next segment.
It's amazing to come up here to the platform and see how many people are out there with us, because when you're in the crowd, you have no idea. Don't let the press tell you. There's more than 100. There's closer to 10,000 people here, all fighting for the same thing. Our schools. We need the books. We need the playgrounds. We don't need the cut schools. Thanks.
I'm Jerry Boyle of the National Lawyers Guild, and you're watching Chicago Independent Television.
Chicago Independent Television is not brought to you by AT&T, the company lobbying hard to destroy network neutrality and public access television. Learn more at SaveTheInternet.com. AT&T, your world degraded.
Welcome back to Chicago Independent Television. Last May, tens of thousands of protesters hit the streets in response to the NATO summit being held in Chicago. 3 of the protesters were brought up on charges of terrorism, charges that many see as questionable. Here is the story as told by one participant of the anti-NATO protests.
No justice, no peace, the police.
We began the day at a jail support rally at 26 in California in regards with the charges against the 3 Bridgeport arrestees that are brought up on what I personally feel are some bogus charges. Last week, there were a car full of protesters in from out of town that got pulled over and harassed by the Chicago Police Department and threatened to have their skulls cracked in, told that they were going to be hunted down at NATO. Somebody in that car ended up filming this video and they got it put through up onto YouTube. That video went out to all the mainstream media and independent media on all the media lists that were available. That created a mass embarrassment for the Chicago Police Department and a PR hit that caused the Superintendent McCarthy to have to respond within hours, which is highly unusual. From then came a raid, which very well may have just been targeting because they had the embarrassment of this video being released, in addition to trying to instill fear into the public to make people not come down for the NATO actions today. The 3 people that were charged up, and it's my understanding that there's been more that have been added to that, but I do not have the details. I think it's up to 5. Were all people in that car and part of that video. And they busted them on having a homemade or a homemaking beer situation, and I have a hard time believing any of what they're saying is going on. We've yet to see, the evidence. We'll see where it goes, but in my personal opinion, I really feel like it's a retaliation from a black eye for the Chicago PD, in addition to a fear campaign that I'm sure is orchestrated from all sorts of federal level powers in order to create that fear and compliance and make people afraid to come out and march and use their constitutional rights against NATO, and saying that these wars are unjust and that this war machine needs to stop. So when the raids happened, there was a pretty big uproar because a lot of us here locally know these people, have been working with these people within protests, been standing side by side, had each other's backs. And so a lot of protesters have been very distressed about this. And so there's actually been a number of rallies and actions that have spurred out of support for these arrestees, support for jail support, getting these arrestees out, support with trying to make sure that everybody knows that the people that are charged should be out. But they did hold most of the arrestees for 48 hours before releasing them, which left time for multiple marches and rallies to have happened within that. It certainly enraged and upset the protesting community here, and felt like that was something that they needed to express using their constitutional rights to do so with freedom of speech and assembly. And so we've had a number of actions, and the largest certainly was the jail support for when these protesters were going up, the ones that are charged, going up to bond court. So from that stemmed a huge day of activities that ended up winding up at 11:30 that evening, and it was extremely powerful, and it showed extreme, violent use of tactics from the Chicago Police Department and the feds, with no violent tactics used by any of the protesters along that way.
Hi, I'm Vermin Supreme, and whenever I'm watching some sort of moving images on a screen, it's indie media for sure.
Chicago Independent Television is not brought to you by Walmart. There's a reason we're the world's most profitable corporation. We pay our employees peanuts. Learn more at walmartwatch.com. Walmart. Always low wages, always.
Welcome back to Chicago Independent Television. As last May's NATO summit was winding down, Chicago activist Joe Iosbaker talked to reporters about the violent police response to the protests. Here are some excerpts.
I disagree with one of the statements that this was out-of-control cops. I didn't see them out of control. I saw them in control. I saw them deliberately, reaching to their throat. Somebody gave them the order. Somebody gave them the order to bust heads, and I can only assume that order came from the top. So then McCarthy cries his crocodile tears. Those didn't move me at all. What moved me is the guy I was helping to stand up, holding his tooth in his mouth. That's what moved me, okay? No black blocker put out a cop's tooth. I just want to give all of the organizers, including myself, a pat on the back. A year ago when we started this, literally no one knew about NATO. The war in Afghanistan was not on the front pages. What we did is we brought together not only the people who are opposed to war, but the people who are affected by war. The nurses marched with us yesterday, and the nurses said, we're here because what this war does to our patients and their communities. Actually, I want to say that the best single footage that I saw was also from above. It was footage done by the Guardian of London, and I'll send it to you if you can't find it online. They had a little boom for their camera, and they were right in the middle of it. It was exactly at the moment of the police charge, and oh yeah, there were a few kids in black getting hit, but there was a kid in orange, there was a kid in blue, there was a kid in a white shirt, and they were smacking anybody that was close enough for their batons.
But wouldn't police say that once they're provoked?
Really? Is that really police training? If somebody provokes you, you get to beat them up?
Thank you. The police is supposed to be the professionals. They're supposed to be in control.
Airmen, Army, soldiers, sailors. That's not the training. They're supposed to be above it.
But they have been warned, and that's the thing.
But the police are the professionals. They're supposed to be in control. When your kid behaves, you beat your kid up.
The area. They didn't say, if you don't move, we're going to beat the shit out of you.
They said if you don't move, you will be arrested.
But they did not do that.
That's different. That's what McCarthy said up until 2 weeks ago. And last week, there was a confrontation where the police basically came in an unprovoked way against 3 young people. And in that video, which is on YouTube, you can find it, one of the cops said, "Billy Club against your head." And they pointed at each one of those 3 young people. The police have been preparing for this mentally, physically, emotionally, preparing to beat us up for a year. This is the violence that NATO is, that NATO brings with them. They come to Chicago, and we get police attacking protesters.
Joe, what's next?
Well, the next thing is we have to stop the occupation of Afghanistan. The president went to Afghanistan 2 weeks ago and said, "Don't worry, everyone, we're getting out of here. Except it's gonna take us 3 years to draw down the 100,000 troops. Oh, and then we're gonna keep some undetermined amount of troops here for another 10 years on the 300 bases that we have in Afghanistan." He's intending to leave somewhere upwards of 50,000 troops there. This is going to be Korea. We're going to have troops there for another decade. That is an occupation.
So what's your plan? What's the candidate's plan, Occupy Chicago's plan for next?
Well, I think what you saw yesterday was a re-emergence of the anti-war movement. Not only was this a local demonstration, this was mostly people with a 606 zip code, but we had people from all over the country and around the world, and I think this is going to result in a new wave of anti-war protests. NATO is the military wing of the G8. They're the muscle of the international 1%. You have to come to Chicago. We have just educated an entire generation of the movement. They understand you can't just fight for your interests and your economic needs. We live in an empire. We oppress people. The United States government oppresses people all over the globe. And those people hate our government for that. And we have a responsibility, those of us who live here, to take a stand against that. When President Obama and Rahm Emanuel invited NATO and the G8 here, they did it before Tahrir Square. They did it before Madison, Wisconsin. They did it before Occupy Wall Street. And now Chicago has once again added our name to that pantheon of cities. When you say the name of Chicago, Chicago, everyone is going to say, oh, that's where the protest against NATO took place. Absolutely. We held a family-friendly protest. At the end of it, whatever provocation took place, the response by the police was outrageous. Period.
The indiscriminate beating with the nightsticks,
targeting of the
blue wall that he said would not push against a line did.
Exactly. He promised, McCarthy promised this wouldn't happen, and they didn't act out of control. He ordered them to start swinging. The CPD is trained to treat civilians like this, but they don't attack without command. They're very disciplined, very disciplined. They attacked under McCarthy's command. I would put money on it. I think this was a success, and on the one hand, they're not beating us up, but I'm not going to thank them for not beating us up. They've got, I mean, how many cops do you think are here? A couple thousand? I think this is unbelievable levels of intimidation. The Occupy movement has no history of violence in Chicago, period. None whatsoever. Neither does the anti-war movement. The police are the only ones with a history of violence. I'm very proud at the coalition we were able to assemble. I'm very proud. You know, last summer when we started the coalition, I actually spoke at the founding meeting, and I said, when the people of Chicago realize who NATO is and what the G8 is, I said they would march in their tens of thousands against these people, because the G8, the bankers of the world, I mean, we all know the financial crisis was caused by the bankers. And then the generals, not just the Pentagon, but all the generals were coming here for a meeting. And you know, I live in my neighborhood, my old neighborhood, Logan Square. I mean, there are kids who died every month in Afghanistan. So when people realize who these people are, I said there would be a giant march of tens of thousands of people, and it happened.
Do you have an estimate on how many people
We have a count. We have 15,000 people. 15,000 people. Joe Lombardo from the United National Anti-War Committee Coalition stepped out of line at the front of the line at the intersection of Michigan and Roosevelt Road and counted noses for the next 30 minutes. 15,000 people.
Chicago Independent Television is not brought to you by Coca-Cola, whose logo is stained red by the blood of murdered Colombian labor union organizers. Learn more at killercoke.org. Coke, the drink of the death squads.
Welcome back to Chicago Independent Television. Just before the NATO summit in Chicago last May, the Pritzker Military Library hosted a debate on the legitimacy of NATO. Here are some excerpts.
Hello, my name is Won Bae, an independent filmmaker for Chicago Indie Media Center. We are here at a Pritzker Military Library on Thursday night and about to see the debate between representatives from NATO and protester groups.
We're here to talk about our grievances. We are protesting on Sunday, and we're going to do a march of reconciliation and justice, where we're asking for NATO officials to come and meet us, to acknowledge us as citizens, as members of their lead country in that alliance, and to respectfully receive our medals back. We are returning our Global War on Terrorism service medals and expeditionary medals. We have decided as an organization that we no longer want to keep these tokens of symbols of failed politics in this ongoing war that's led by US and NATO.
We talk about NATO as if it was an organization by itself. It isn't really. And I think complaints about NATO are really better directed at the governments that sponsor NATO, because the NATO is the sum of its parts. I think a lot of the objection is really to US policy, and I have objections about some of it myself. It has been found to be a very useful organization of like-minded Western democracies with similar interests, similar values, and similar economic systems. it is so useful, in my opinion, that if it didn't exist, would have to create it.
I know the title is, contains an allusion to a new NATO. I just want to make it clear I'm not in favor of a new NATO, a reformed NATO, kinder, gentler NATO. I'm in favor, absolutely, of the abolition of NATO, which is the world's only military bloc, and in my estimate, the greatest threat to world peace. NATO is the largest military bloc in human history with 28 members. In terms of its range, having conducted wars, and I'll defend the choice of the word wars, in 3 continents in 13 years, in Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, increasingly over the border in Pakistan, in North Africa last year, where they flew almost 10,000 air sorties, combat missions over a country of 6 million people, Libya. NATO does not need to be reformed. It should have been dissolved when the Warsaw Pact was dissolved 21 years ago, and it needs to be dissolved now.
The founding of NATO came in a context, as Rick has noted, about the UN. The UN Declaration, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, came after World War II with 50 million deaths, the Holocaust, and the Soviet threat of taking over Eastern Europe, and the blockade of Berlin. So in that context, the United States foreign policy established itself to defend our friends, our Western friends in Europe, and promised them that we would come to their aid. So NATO was founded with Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. The expectation was that we would go to the aid of Western Europe should the Soviet Union invade. What do we do with NATO? Is it out of business? Because we've achieved what we set out to do in 1949. This is in 1989, 1990. In 1991, the Soviet Union disappears. And that led to 1999, when NATO decided to do, among other things, to intervene militarily on a humanitarian basis to end Milosevic's killing in Kosovo. That was a new mission. And that goes on to the question of Libya today. That was also a mission. So there's a change in what NATO's doing, and we're right to debate this issue.
But we're spending so much money on continuing these wars. The last estimate I got was it would be $4 billion annually to continue beyond 2014 training and maintaining the Afghan forces. What can we do in this country, in this economy with $4 billion a year?
Again, in the public relations material that is gushing out of every sewer in Chicago in favor of NATO over the past year, I mean, it's unbelievable saturation. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs has brought in Madeleine Albright and R. Nicholas Burns, and Madeleine Albright spoke to a high school in the south side of Chicago a few weeks ago. There are NATO officials, pro-NATO spokesmen talking at high schools in the suburbs. I mean, this has been an inundation of pro-NATO propaganda, but what they fail to tell you is simple facts. It is now over 10.5 years since the invasion of Afghanistan on October 7th, 2001. This is the longest war in the history of Afghanistan. It is arguably the longest war as defined by continuous independent combat operations in the history of the United States. As of last year, the NATO-led International Security Assistance Force had 152,000 troops from 50 nations. This is far larger than Soviet peak strength, during the earlier Afghan war. And the fact that NATO has pulled together an international network of 50 nations willing to send their sons and daughters to kill and die in a useless war is an indication, again, of how dangerous a phenomenon NATO has become in the post-Cold War era. There have been statements by leading NATO military officials like Admiral James Stavridis, who's a major NATO military commander in Europe of late, praising the role of American allies in Kosovo, Yugoslavia, in Afghanistan, and in Libya. That is, wars, again, in 3 continents, and basically suggesting that the wars aren't meant to be won. They're used as testing grounds for the United States and NATO to build up a global expeditionary military force for the next war. And if I may, real quickly, sure. The Washington Post last month had an editorial calling for NATO intervention in Mali, in northwestern Africa. Several times over the past week, the Prime Minister of Turkey has talked about invoking NATO's Article 5 Mutual Military Assistance Clause, which would mean war against Syria. This is a mechanism that evidently any major member of the alliance at any point can go to Brussels, invoke Article 5, and declare war on people in most every part of the world. It is nothing less than that.
Chicago Independent Television is not brought to you by Blackwater, a worldwide leader in security and murder. Learn more at blackwaterbook.com. Blackwater, we kill innocent Iraqis so that you can feel more secure.
Welcome back to Chicago Independent Television. Next, we'll hear from a Chicago activist on a range of topics surrounding the NATO summit that took place in Chicago last May.
Any number of social needs could be met in this country if we didn't have the horrific spending of NATO and the United States. The United States has got to stop supporting abusive regimes that commit human rights crimes every bit as bad as the countries that the United States beats up on. We live in a country that spends as much on its military as the rest of the world combined. We live in a country when, combined with NATO military spending, is some 70% of world military spending. That isn't defense, that is empire. We look at the titanic, savage inequalities in our country, whether the $700 million budget deficit looming in our Board of Education, the $500 million budget deficit looming next year in our public transportation system in the city, the 100,000 homes in foreclosure in Chicago, the halving of our mental health clinics. The list goes on and on and on. These sort of things could be taken care of if we were not spending $2 billion a week on the war in Afghanistan. We are marching against NATO because NATO is the international fig leaf for American power and domination over other peoples of the world. Threats of war that the NATO alliance and the United States often issue against regimes that are opposed to it. We know that whoever is in office in January 2013, he is going to be a pro-war, pro-1% president. If we're going to change things around, it's not going to be through the ballot box in November. It's by people getting back into the streets and building our social movements, building a real opposition to both parties, which is the way that all social gains in this country, and frankly, countries around the world, have ever been won.
You've been watching Chicago Independent Television, a project of the Chicago Independent Media Center Video Collective. The Independent Media Center is a growing worldwide network of media producers, journalists, citizens, and activists, working to put the media in the hands of everyday people and away from corporate and commercial interests. To learn more, visit our website at chicago.indiemedia.org. There you can find out about upcoming Chicago area events and how to get involved in making your own media, including how to help make this very TV show. Thanks for watching. See you next time.